So we're looking at this Kennedy question 2 from 2012. It's a speech that he gave publicly during a recession. He kind of calls out the steel industry for their business practices. The steel industry is raising the price in their the cost or whatever the price of their goods, and it's causing stress on the American economy. And so President Kennedy made this speech in 1962 and really kind of criticized the American steel industry, and more really the tycoons at the head of it for raising their prices during a time of recession. And so I'll let you guys, read through it, but if you haven't already, because we're going to focus on the two responses today, but it's basically a big guilt trip. And so he uses a lot of different kind of emotional appeals to try and, make the American people see how unfair the steel industry is being. He kind of challenges, them as Americans. So the first sample we're going to look at is the effective sample. That's sample 2A. Get my little highlighter ready. So throughout his speech, in which he condemned companies for raising steel prices, Kennedy repeatedly appeals to a sense of communal sacrifice and collective responsibility in order to rally his everyman audience around this ostensible cause for outrage. So even in the first sentence right away here, this writer is not waiting to, get to their point. He or she uses some pretty strong words. They say condemned. It's a really nice verb there, really capturing what Kennedy is doing. He's publicly ridiculing and condemning the steel industry. This appeal to a sense of communal sacrifice. Are all things that, this is all pathos, right? He wants to rally his audience around a cause for outrage. Oops. Sorry about that. Messed up my marker. Couldn't highlight. So so far this is this is building into a pathos analysis, right? They've noticed that Kennedy is using a lot of emotional appeal here to try and get the American people to turn against the steel industry. From the beginning, Kennedy, a millionaire Harvard graduate, includes himself in the aggrieved camp of everyday Americans by using the first person we. The list of sacrifices being made by the 185 million Americans are thus shared by him as well. He is on their side, united with them. Yet on the very same breath in which he lumps himself in with the rest of the country, he takes another privileged group, the, quote, tiny handful of steel executives, and sets them apart, separate. Such us versus them distinction is a critical justification for the contempt and righteous indignation that Kennedy heaps on the steel companies. So here we've got a pretty good example of a body paragraph. I know it's hard to tell it's a body paragraph because they don't indent. And so what's really important here now is that we notice that Kennedy is still building his argument off of pathos, but he's separating himself out of the group, right? I think this writer does a good job of recognizing that Kennedy is a millionaire as well, but he makes himself seem like he is just a regular guy by including himself with the American people, right? And those American people are united, against this tiny handful of steel executives, and that creates a sense of separation. Okay, and that separation leads to contempt, right? Which is what Kennedy wants. Kennedy wants the American people to see themselves as being separate from the tiny handful of steel executives, and he wants them to hold them with contempt, because that will get the steel executives to do what Kennedy wants them to do, which is lower the cost of steel to try to make the economy work a little bit better for the American people, which will make Kennedy more popular in the people's eyes. It's very similar to what we're going through right now. If an executive in federal office can get private industry to do what they want to make life easier and more comfortable for the American people, that executive's popularity with that American people, the people that put them in power, is going to go up. And so this is as much a political move here on Kennedy's part as it is a humanitarian one. And so what I really want you to look at in this paragraph, though, is the structure. So it's not a very long paragraph, but you'll see, it kind of separated into a couple little steps that we've talked about many times. We talked about WPAE. They start with a topic sentence here at the top. And then they put some paraphrasing in for what they mean, right? They use this quote, we, to talk about how he's using first person to make that united setup, okay? And then instead of just leaving it at that, they come back, and most importantly, they explain why that's important. Why is it important that Kennedy use we? Well, if Kennedy unites himself with the American people, and he also separates out the steel executives from everyone else, then his resulting separation and contempt is going to be more likely to happen. If Kennedy does not separate himself from the millionaire elite steel executives, and he does not separate himself and also align himself with the American people, then they can't share his contempt. To the American people, they would just see one rich guy mad at a bunch of other rich guys. And so Kennedy has to find a way to get people to see him as a regular guy. We'll continue real quick. But his appeal does not rest solely on class warfare, because if he played up the class bit for too long, he would lose the faith of his hardworking and self-sacrificing audience. So he switches to real, tangible patriotism. After all, there is a war on. And so the pitch is not limited to union workers, but also extends to reservists, to servicemen, and every American businessman and farmer. These professionals connote a fighting spirit, rugged individual ingenuity and self-reliance, 100% Americanism. Kennedy's far from being in bed with the unions. He's careful to note, albeit without elaborating, that the steel companies enjoy a, quote, unusually good labor contract, implying that the steel companies have every right and reason to succeed. But his litany of economic statistics lend further credibility to his condemnation of steel companies, precluding the possibility of companies replying, quote, it was necessary for business. And so this is a really important distinction in this paragraph too. They did a good job of connecting their points, showing the transition right. He wasn't just trying to create contempt for the wealthy during a time of struggle. He was also trying to get them to see that, this is a time of patriotism. There's a war on, right? We're supposed to be unified, and here these steel tycoons are only looking out for themselves, and they're hurting the war effort, okay? And so they do a really good job of transitioning their original point into their next point. And I think where this paragraph really starts to shine is down here where they make this point at the end. Okay, they talk about how the steel unions do have a good labor contract, right? Um, but at the same time, Kennedy doesn't want to come across as too liberal, right? This is the Cold War. He does not want to seem like, people shouldn't have the right to become wealthy through business, because that's, a very un-American idea, especially in 1962. And so, it's what he wants to do is make sure that people recognize that he believes that the steel companies do have a right and a reason to succeed, but he doesn't want them to be able to gouge the American people and use this necessary for business excuse as a justification for that reckless capitalism, if you want to call it that. And so, this is where I think this paper really starts to shine in terms of getting that sophistication point, because they're not just seeing the emotional Kennedy versus the steel tycoons angle. They're also seeing it from a larger political and economic scale, that Kennedy would have to be sensitive to. And so that's really insightful. Further evidence here of Kennedy's rhetorical caution can be found in his disclaimer that price and wage decisions are and ought to be freely and privately made. In 1962, it would have been unprecedented for a president to coerce a private company into taking a specific economic action. Again, we're getting back to that kind of Cold War. We don't want to be too hard on somebody just trying to make a buck in terms of supporting capitalism. But again, Kennedy invokes the uncontroversially virtuous idea of a higher responsibility so as not to undermine his message. In his final closing lines, he cleverly puts the ball in his opponent's court. Kennedy does not directly go on the war path to appeal to be aggressive, yet he manages to appear strong and principled without giving the steel companies any ammunition to respond to the actual substance of his speech. And so, they're identifying Kennedy's, lack of a direct call to action here, which is an element of argument, which is totally something you can analyze when you're doing rhetorical analysis. If you recognize it as an argument, use what you know about argument, right? Supportive reasoning, find their counter-arguing if they're using it, find if they're doing a strong call to action, or if they're, like in this case, Kennedy, resisting the urge to directly call out the steel tycoons to just change and stop being so capitalist. He implies that they have a higher responsibility. He implies that they, have a patriotic duty. He implies that they have a humanitarian interest in seeing, protecting the little guy. But he never comes out and says, that these steel tycoons should not be, economically successful in their business. Because that would be un-American and anti-capitalist, and he would receive a lot of criticism for it.